particularly dangerous, but some of them have not been around that long, and so we don't really know what the long-term effects are. And then someone asked a question about metabolism, and if there were sort of female hormone-driven specific differences in fat and carbohydrate metabolism, and so therefore women metabolize fat differently than men or not. They send me a link to a TED Talk. I'm like, I don't want fucking homework for. But I got to watch the TED Talk before class on Monday now, so I can actually see what they're saying. Because, you know, things. All right, I'm better now. Okay, so what we're going to cover today and Tuesday, we'll probably don't have to finish it up then. This is the single most difficult conceptual stuff to me that we cover in the entire class. Okay, so this is the time and the place to really kind of lock all of this in and try to understand what's going on. So if you're not following things, then I'm absolutely going to need you to kind of tell me so that we can back up and try to talk about all of this stuff again. Okay? So what we're going to get into is what's called rate control of metabolism. So the overarching concept is the idea that all metabolic pathways are active all the time, but in certain instances, during exercise, at rest, based on certain patterns of your diet and whatnot, different metabolic pathways are going to be the predominant ones. We're going to get into what is it that's controlling it? What are the things about intensity that are going to change which one is predominant? Okay? What is it about how long you've been exercising that may change the one that's going to be predominant? In addition to all of that, the pathway may be predominant. So you may, if I walk for a very long time, the aerobic pathway outside of the first couple of minutes is probably going to be the predominant pathway from which I derive energy the whole time. But the longer I go, I'm going to potentially change if I'm using carbs, if I'm using fat, etc. in all of this. Okay? So we're going to try to get at a kind of general idea of what's controlling this. There are enzymes that control them, there's individual control steps in each pathway. And we need to understand how all of those things interact. Okay? So remember this, they're all active all the time. The one that predominates, okay, is going to depend upon the energy demand of your activity. Okay? Resting can be an activity, right? Sleeping can be an activity in addition to running, biking, jogging, walking. So how much energy do we need? And then what is the speed of a particular metabolic pathway? So it is essentially supply versus demand. Right? At least initially, right? When the muscles need ATP to continue to run the phosphate, then what happens? They don't care. The muscle doesn't care where the ATP comes from. It just knows demand is here. I need to get to that level of demand. Okay? And so it's sort of the damn the consequences of whatever's going to happen. I need to use pathways. I need this much. Get it for me right now, and then we'll sort everything else out later. Okay? So that's kind of what we need to understand, because that's why exercise intensity is such a big component in rate control, is that the higher the intensity, the greater the force needs are going to be, therefore the greater the ATP demand is going to be. And so it's our ability, in essence, to kind of match supply and demand that are going to kind of play this big role in rate control. Okay. So if we just look at this in a very general kind of top level sense, we've already covered this a little bit, but the speed of the pathways are going to be the phosphate pathways are faster. Glycolysis, okay, so going all the way to lactic acid, pyruvate going to the Krebs cycle through the electron transport chain, having this activated phosphorylation. That's the slopes. Okay? So we need to look then at kind of what is the thing that controls how fast each one of these goes, and we manipulate that, right? And make them speed up or slow down. So rate control of creatine phosphate is pretty easy. It's a very simple reaction. It's one step. It's driven by the creatine kinase enzyme. Okay. Rate control of creatine phosphate pathway is very simple. It's the levels in the cytoplasm of ADP. Okay. So when we have ATP turnover, so you've got 8 molecules of ATP. We're splitting off the phosphate group, and we're going to end up with ADP and inorganic phosphate. As the cross-bridge cycle runs more and more, we're going to begin to cleave more and more of this. The concentration inside the cytoplasm of both ADP and PI, right, are going to go up. So if you guys see this, remember your chemistry or your biochemistry. When we have them in brackets, that denotes concentration. So as this rises, then that's going to drive our reaction. Okay? Increased ADP levels. We need the ADP. When the ADP interacts with the creatine kinase enzyme, that drives the cleaving of phosphate off of creatine phosphate and putting it on the D. Okay? That's a very simple chemical reaction. Make one thing on one side of the equation go up, it drives then to equilibrium onto the other side. Very simple, very straightforward. Okay. So we tend to use creatine phosphate until it's gone. Okay? Until it's gone. So even if I'm walking, I'm using some. I'm probably not going to use it at very, very low exercise intensities. I'm probably not going to fully deplete creatine phosphate because energy demand is so low. You have to remember, I'm getting some from here, I'm getting some from glycolysis, I'm getting a bunch from here, and so my balance is not going to get kind of tipped too far. Demand is not going to get too high, and that kind of drives things. Okay? Because you can imagine, like I'm walking. I can take off and sprint really quickly while I'm walking. Right? It would be an indicator that I got a little bit of creatine phosphate. But if it's at high levels, you're going to use the creatine phosphate, right? Kelvin, what are we working out today? Yeah. Is it second chest day for the week? Okay. Kelvin's going to bench today. And so, what are we doing? I mean, you don't have to embarrass me that bad. But how many set and reps are we doing today? 4 sets of 6. Okay? Kelvin's going to start, and he's going to need so much force that he may not deplete all of his creatine phosphate by the time he gets to rep 6. He might not be that far off from doing all of that. Okay? So it's high intensity, you use it until it's basically gone. Okay. That's the easy one. That's the easy one. Now comes the one that wants to make your head all scrambled around. Okay? So glycolysis, in some ways, is even more, its rate control is even more complicated than like the Krebs cycle. Okay? So there are 4 primary control enzymes in rate control of glycolysis. Okay? 4 primary control ones. So let me do this, and it will hopefully help you guys understand maybe a little bit more about what's going on. So remember when I told you guys to look at glycolysis, just imagine we've got glucose, right? We're going down here, pyruvate, and then the pyruvate can go in 2 different directions, okay? So we've got phosphorylase enzyme that is going to be a control step right here. It's basically step number 1 in glycolysis. Then we're going to come down another step, and we're going to have the rate control enzyme for sure, which is PFK. Then we're going to come down, when we've got the pyruvate, we're going to have this competition between LDH and something called PDH, okay, that are going to be down here. So there's these 4 enzymes that are going to work together to, in some ways, control how much glucose is getting to pyruvate, but also to then control how much of that pyruvate is becoming lactic acid, and how much of it is going to go into the Krebs cycle. Okay? So remember, I'm wrong. Okay. Phosphorylase isn't there. This is hexokinase. It's been one of those days. And hexokinase is actually really fast, so we're just going to take that off. That's not really a control enzyme. My apologies. Okay. So phosphorylase, in many ways, actually precedes. It's going to precede phosphorylase is going to help us get glucose. Okay. Phosphorylase is an enzyme that drives the breakdown of glycogen. Drives the breakdown of glycogen, both in the muscle and in the liver. So muscle glycogen gets broken down, you're going to have glucose 6-phosphate in the cell, ready to go. We break down liver glycogen, we're going to start dumping glucose from the liver into the blood. So phosphorylase is what is called an allosteric enzyme. So from a biochemical standpoint, allosteric means that it can be sort of turned up or turned down in its speed, okay, depending upon what it interacts. So the activity of phosphorylase is going to be increased by alkaline. It's going to be increased by increasing levels of AMP and ADP, and by epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay? Hopefully you guys will see that all of those things, okay, all of those things are going to increase during exercise. Free calcium is going to be circulating around for muscle contraction. Okay? ADP levels, and in some instances, AMP levels are going to rise because we're increasing ATP turnover. And although we haven't talked about it at all, Dr. Dev isn't teaching in the class. Very high intensity, like when Kelvin goes to do bench press, he's going to get this big, rapid increase in epinephrine and norepinephrine. If you run or you walk, you're going to get a much more gradual along. But it is definitely going to go up, and these are going to increase the activity. So when you increase the activity of phosphorylase, it immediately begins to break down glycogen to make more glucose. So the body is doing something. Whether you ever use all of this glucose or not is irrelevant. Okay? It's just going to dump fluid, dump fuel, okay, into the muscle, into the bloodstream, so that we've got substrate available. Because if we need to run glycolysis, we can use this very quickly. So at least we've got something there that's ready and available. Okay? All right. So this is outside. So this is controlling glycogen. My apologies for my confusion today. But in glycolysis, this is the third step is controlled by an enzyme called phosphofructose. Abbreviated as PFA. Okay? This is the rate-limiting step or the rate-limiting enzyme in the entire glycolytic pathway. What that means to be the rate-limiting step is this is the slowest enzyme, this is the slowest step. Okay? So we're dumping bunches and bunches and bunches of glucose here, but we can't turn it down here into pyruvate. We can only go as fast as PFK will let us. Okay? PFK is also an allosteric. Right? It can be inhibited, or its activity can be slowed down by high levels of ATP, by high levels of creatine phosphate, by lots of citrate, okay, and hydrogen. So high ATP, high creatine phosphate, those are things that happen at rest. Right? So PFK is running pretty slowly at rest. Running pretty slow. Hydrogen ions are going to come from the accumulation of lactic acid. So that's at very high exercise intensities during some prolonged. So when we're well over lactate threshold, we begin to make this, which then slows this down, which is going to jam up the entire process. Which is one of the reasons that formation of lactic acid causes fatigue. It's going to directly inhibit glycolysis. High levels of citrate can come from a couple of places. You may have lots of citrate because you're doing lots of fat metabolism. You may also have lots of citrate because you're dumping a large amount of this pyruvate into the crush side. That's going to kind of slow things down, right? The idea is that even though we've dumped a bunch of glucose and made it available, we don't necessarily need to convert to pyruvate and run things this way if we don't have to. One of our kind of mechanisms to try to help us match supply and demand. So if we're supplying plenty, because the Krebs cycle is going, that's going to slow this down. If you're supplying plenty of citrate because you're using fat rather than carbohydrates, that's also going to slow down. It is activated by AMP and ADP. It's activated by inorganic phosphate, and it's also activated by ammonia. Yeah, activated by ammonia. So those are going to be things we're going to turn on. So in general, when you start exercising, you get a lot of ATP turnover. Okay. So that's going to be kind of the way that one's going to work. Okay. And our other enzymes are going to be down here, and what's really going to happen is there's going to be this competition between LDH and PDH for turning the pyruvate into one of our pathways or the others. Okay? So lactate dehydrogenase and pyruvate dehydrogenase. LDH is very specific to muscle fiber type. Okay? And it's going to exist in these different, what we call isozymes. So there's a heart isozyme and a muscle isozyme. The heart isozyme is slow. Okay? So in slow twitch muscle fibers, LDH has two subunits that are heart subunits, so it's slower, so it's less active. And then like 2X fibers, it's got two muscle subunits, so it's going to be a little bit faster. Okay? Pyruvate dehydrogenase is going to be the thing that drives pyruvate into the Krebs cycle and turns into A. Pyruvate is going to be activated. It is allosteric, whereas LDH is not particularly allosteric. It's going to be activated by ADP and calcium, and it's activated by high levels of pyruvate, which is a kind of a beneficial thing. It's going to be intended to be inhibited by low levels of muscle glycogen and by higher levels of free fatty acids in the blood or inside. Okay? So, exercise is going to tend to increase the rate of PDH function. Not going to have a big thing on LDH. We'll talk a little bit more about kind of how we balance those two things. Okay? You guys with me so far? PDH is allosteric. Well, LDH, not really. Well, I haven't looked at a biochemistry book in a while, so maybe we've changed our mind on LDH, but there we go. Okay? So, I want to show you guys this. Okay? So remember, if we want to increase the function of the aerobic metabolic pathway, we are going to have to send more and more pyruvate into the Krebs cycle. Okay? So this graph is going to depict for you the activity of PDH, okay, over time, over 10 minutes of exercise, whether you're walking, or you're jogging, kind of at a nice brisk pace, and then these people must be quite fit if they're able to run for 10 minutes at 90%. Okay? But what I want you guys to look at is, see this, it takes about a minute or thereabouts for it to get up to where it needs to be. And when you're walking or you're jogging, it's going to pretty much level out because we're in a pretty good place to be able to match PDH activity and pyruvate almost exclusively sending all of it over into the mitochondria. Whereas at even higher levels, it's going to continue to kind of ramp up a little bit. But what I want you guys to focus on is this piece right here. Okay? That piece. In the first minute of exercise, okay, PDH starts off being low, and it's going to ramp itself up kind of pretty quickly, but it's going to take it a minute or so. So remember, in oxygen deficit, I need energy right now. It's going to take a minute or thereabouts to be able to get PDH ramped up to its required speed. And so while that is happening, energy demand is the same. So we're probably going to then drive more pyruvate to lactic acid, and we're going to have some glycolytic pathway there or creatine phosphate. Okay? So one of the things we talk about is during oxygen deficit is simply that it takes time. It takes time to ramp up PDH activity. It takes time to ramp up the activity in the Krebs cycle. It takes time to ramp up activity in the electron transport. And so we will see, though, in a couple of slides, I hope, why these are in the same people. Okay? You're comparing you at various exercise intensities, but you guys will hopefully see when we look at people that are more or less trained, why this time frame may shift a little bit based on that. Okay?
So what would the effect of the warm-up have on the cost? If you didn't give enough warm-up,
Should shrink it down. Absolutely, it should shrink it down. So if you're a more distance-oriented athlete, or maybe in some ways even like a middle-distance athlete, a good warm-up is probably beneficial from a metabolic standpoint. If you're a sprinter, maybe not, because it's so short that it's not going to matter. And if you're like a super long distance runner, then who cares what the first, like you're going to, as long as you can go at the pace that you want in your first couple of minutes, then that's probably not going to be that detrimental. Although I say that, has anybody watch, after I said that, has anybody watched the Chasing 2 documentary at all? No? Okay. If you have Disney Plus, it's on there. Maybe if you have Hulu, you can get it. It was on National Geographic, but it's the guys trying to break the 2-hour marathon. And they talk about that, I mean, the guy was like, in his initial attempt when he doesn't get it, it's like 1 second a mile that he's on. If you run each mile 1 second faster, you make it. Okay? Can you imagine that? Right? Like I've run for, I've been running for practically 2 hours. And, I tell you, oh, that warm-up doesn't matter, but in your first mile, if you could shave 3 seconds off there, that's 3 seconds that you've got somewhere else. So I simply doesn't matter that much. And that's your goal of everything. But yes, you're absolutely right. That would be a benefit of the warm-up. Next, you're going to ask me what the benefit of the cool-down is, and I'm going to be like, I don't know. Right? So you're going to ask me what the benefit of stretching is, and I'm going to say, there is none. Right? Unless you're a gymnast and you want to be more flexible, there's no benefit to stretching. Right? There's no scientifically proven benefits. No evidence that it prevents injury. There's no evidence that it does anything that makes you more flexible. So, that one doesn't go over well with the Black household because my wife loves to do some stretching. And I hate stretching. She just tells me that I'm biased. Because, let me see, can I touch my toes? Nope. What are you getting there? Okay. Cool. SI joint pain. I have SI joint, like, tendonitis, weirdly enough, from, I carry Ellis only, I can only carry her in my left arm. So I can do things with my right arm. You guys don't think about this. Like, I try to put her over here on my dominant arm, and I'm like, why can't I hold my child and do this? So I've only ever held her in my left arm. So I do this, and so it puts me in this, like, lean and everything. So I have left-sided SI joint pain. You all will have that one day when you're old. It's okay. Just prepare yourselves. Yeah. Kelvin.
What are your views on like PNF stretching?
What are my views on PNF?
Yeah.
I mean, in what particular way? Like, should you do it? Should you not?
Is there any, like, do you think there's any benefit to that?
What benefit for what?
I guess increasing, or not increasing the length, but like allowing for more range of motion to be.
Certainly, if you do PNF stretching, and it's done correctly, you can clearly move to a greater range of motion immediately, right? I mean, all we're doing is we're turning on the muscle system. You're getting relaxation on the opposite side, and so that lets you move to a greater range of motion. Problem is that you wait like 20 minutes and you're all back to normal, right? And so if your goal is to increase range of motion, I've never looked, I don't know, it would make sense to me that you did PNF stretching rather than static stretching. That was how you sort of train yourself to increase your range of motion. It would be possible to do that you could get a greater increase faster. And I'm not here to suggest that you shouldn't stretch or that being more flexible is bad. It's just this idea that, like, oh, well, we worked out today, now I'm going to stretch, so now I'm not going to be injured. I'm like, if you're injured, you're already injured. It's not going to fix it, right? So I'm the least flexible person that I know. I've done a lot of sprinting in my life, and I've never pulled a muscle. Like, my hamstrings are terribly inflexible. I've never had a hamstring problem whatsoever. I had a couple of buddies that I played high school baseball, football, and basketball. They always had a hamstring problem. They could freaking like put their elbows at their feet, and it's just that you pull a hamstring. That's like a catastrophic failure in some way. So, if you're going to tell me that having greater range of motion is beneficial for your sport, even if you're not like a gymnast or something, of course, I'm sure that it probably is in that particular way. It's not some magic cure-all kind of thing. Damage is already done. You're going to be sore. These hindrances today, these blocks today, I'm going to be sore stretching now. I'll feel better now, but it's not going to make me feel better later. Once you're already sore, you can stretch, and it hurts, and so that inhibits the pain response. You feel better for a little while, and then you sit down for an hour, and you're back to still being just sore. Many used to make really my first practice position in the free athletic training. I used to say this thing. Man, it was so my life. I used to be like, why are y'all doing this? Why are y'all icing people? What's the point of icing? What's the scientific evidence that icing? What's the scientific evidence that putting the laser stuff on there works? Well, but I'm like, does it? Does it work? Does it matter? Does papers and all that? So there's, I don't know what people think about icing. There's we're gonna have to. Okay, we ventured very far afield talking about how do we get on stretching? What the hell was that about? How do we get there? What was I talking about? I know I did, but what was the point? Oh yeah, that part of the warm-up. Okay. Yes. Metabolically, the warm-up may be okay. So here you guys can see on all of this that we've got, right? We've got pyruvate dehydrogenase, and you've got glycolysis here, you've got pyruvate here. We're running this 50%. This is showing, okay, some of the things that are going to inhibit PDH, some of the things that are going to permanently inhibit, like okay, arsenic. That's going to inhibit PDH. That's why the arsenic will kill you. It stops the metabolism. You can't make energy. But then, like high levels of calcium is going to, from the muscle contractions, is going to activate it. And then some of these other things like low oxygen, high cycle, high PDH, high levels of ATP. That's kind of what's going on. The world is conspiring against me. Okay, so let's put all of this together. Okay. to talk about the rate control of glycolysis. So we talked about the enzymes, okay? And what we're really trying to drive are two things to control the rate of glycolysis. The first is glucose going to pyruvate, okay? That is driven primarily by phosphorylase, making glucose be available, and more so even by phospholipid. Okay? So if we want glycolysis to speed up, we need to dump more glucose in, and we need to ramp up the speed of our steady step. Okay? That's a part of the control. Then the next piece is going to be, well, once we've made the pyruvate, what happens to it? And that's going to be controlled by LDH and to some extent pH. Okay? So we have to have pyruvate available to interact with our enzyme. And then we need to figure out to what extent can PDH and the oxidative pathways soak up that pyruvate. Okay? I said that there's not really a preference. It is adaptively better. Okay? The body does not like to have fatigue. And so when we turn pyruvate into lactic acid, there is a chance that we can fatigue. When we turn the pyruvate and it goes into the Krebs cycle, that is not going to cause any kind of fatigue. And so adaptively, it is better the more of the pyruvate that we make that goes into the Krebs cycle. Right? So in some ways, that's going to be the preferential manner. And what it comes down to then is pyruvate that cannot be shuttled into the Krebs cycle gets left around. When it's left around, then it's going to interact with LDH, and that's going to drive us into lactic acid. Okay? So, we're not really going to be, right, we don't have a lack of oxygen. Oxygen doesn't really do anything in glycolysis. We don't really have that much lack of an oxygen to back up the electron transport chain. And so what we look at is going to be that glycolysis becomes our primary or predominant energy pathway when the rate of formation of pyruvate exceeds the rate at which it can be taken into the Krebs cycle. Okay? Because that means then that our levels of lactate or our levels of lactic acid formation are going to begin to steadily rise. So just imagine, right, we've got a bathtub and we are driving the top part of our thing, we're driving the formation of pyruvate from up here with phosphorylase and PFK. At some point, right, the pyruvate then is going to get driven over into our bathtub, which is the aerobic pathway. As that bathtub fills up, at some point, that's all we can handle. We cannot put any more pyruvate into the bathtub. And so then we've got to start then, the faucet's still on, we're still making lots of pyruvate, the bathtub is full. Now we're going to start taking these little buckets, right, that are going to be making lactic acid or something, and fill up the extra, throw it out over here. Now we're getting a floor wet. We don't like to get the floor wet. I get a lot of bathtub analogies because Alice now gets in the bathtub and her favorite thing is to fill her, you know, we have a cup we fills her hair with, but she fills it up and she wants to dump it out onto the bathroom floor or onto my towel, and those kinds of things. She thinks it's the best thing in the world. So I have lots of bathtub analogies. Does that make sense, guys? Okay? So think about it. When might this happen? Well, at the onset of exercise. When PDH levels are slower, despite the fact that we have a bathtub, we can't dump as much of it into the bathtub because PDH is slowing us down. So at the onset of exercise and during high intensity exercise when we've stimulated so much formation of pyruvate, okay, that the bathtub is full, so we're going to start going in some direction. We're always getting a little bit of this, but it's adaptively better if the pyruvate goes into the Krebs cycle. All right, well now let's talk about what's happening on the other things of pyruvate. Let's talk about what's happening in the bathtub. So how do we control oxidative metabolism? How do we control those things? Well, the first part is going to be it's the rate of the electron transport, the back end. Okay, like everything else, rate is controlled by the slowest steps. Okay, So at rest, electron transport chain is largely inhibited. It runs pretty slow because we don't need to make that much energy. There's no need for us to make extra. So electron transport chain is largely inhibited by ATP. So we have high ATP at rest, it's mostly inhibited. As that gets cleaved, again, ADP and inorganic phosphate are going to stimulate it and increase its rate. Okay? So the increase in electron transport chain activity leads to an increased need for oxygen and therefore increased oxygen. So when you start exercising, when you start talking about that your oxygen consumption is beginning to rise, what that means is that electron transport chain is using more oxygen. That's where the oxygen is being used. That's how we measure oxygen. We can make that assumption that this is getting. Now, this is a little bit slower, but the other piece of these things is that the Krebs cycle, in some instances, can also be a limiting factor. Okay? Generally, the rate of the Krebs cycle is going to be controlled by the rate of the electron transport chain, because the Krebs cycle only becomes kind of slow enough that it's going to be slower than electron transport chain when NAD and FAD molecules are not being recycled fast. Okay? So in general, the Krebs cycle runs pretty fast. It's generally able to handle a fairly large amount of pyruvate. Where it runs into trouble, though, is if we can't take our electron carriers and get them recycled to the electron transport chain fast enough to keep up with all of the pyruvate. Okay? So rate of Krebs is also going to be increased by ADP and PI and by the oxidized version, the NAD, and it is going to be, we have high ATP and high levels of NADH. So again, at rest, when we've got a fair amount of NADH and our ATP levels are fine, then it's going to be largely inhibited. But then during exercise, during submaximal exercise, aerobic metabolism, and this hopefully at this point is not going to be that crazy for you guys. It's sometimes very hard for us to grasp. During submaximal exercise, oxygen is not a limiting factor. Okay? Oxygen is not the thing that's stopping the electron transport chain from working. Okay? Oxygen is not the thing that's slowing everything up. At maximal exercise levels, aerobic metabolism is going to reach its maximal rate. At its maximal rate, it may be limited by oxygen. Okay? You go to altitude and then shit gets crazy. Go to altitude, there's less oxygen. Yes, oxygen very much becomes limiting. But what it does is it just reduces your maximum. And so at a submaximal exercise level at altitude, you're still not limited by oxygen, but your max goes way down because you're limited by oxygen. And so really, here's the only place that it matters. You can go to base camp for Mount Everest and you pick Jacob's VH max is, I don't know, VH max is Jacob.
I don't know.
40, 45,
Let's go.
70, right?
I wish.
You go up. Callie's is probably like 80, the way that she used to run. I don't know if she still runs that much now. She did, but I mean, at like base camp, it's down. I don't know, it's down half. It's not much. Right? Then you get up there and you acclimatize, and you get a little bit of it back, and the volume changes. Here's the big thing. When I train aerobically, my mitochondrial numbers increase. Okay? I have more mitochondria. When I train aerobically, training does not alter. We cannot alter the kinetics of the enzyme. So the rates at which the enzymes work all by themselves never change. Okay? But I have more mitochondria. How might that make my aerobic metabolism better? How might that make I have a bigger bathtub, right? I can put more pyruvate in there. Okay? And so the byproduct biochemically of all of this, because, who's had biochemistry? Anybody? Jacob's the only one. Do you remember something called a Michaelis-Menten plot from biochemistry? No? Okay, well, you can plot the kinetics of enzyme on something called a Michaelis-Menten plot, where you plot basically enzyme concentration against how much sort of product you're getting out of the pathway. If you do Michaelis-Menten plots, when you double the concentration of an enzyme by doubling the mitochondria, the rate the enzyme works doesn't change, but the amount of product you get, because there's a more likely chance that the pyruvate will interact with pH and something is going to get more out of it, even though the enzyme rate itself doesn't change. Really cool. Okay? So when you train aerobically, you get more mitochondria, therefore you dramatically can increase the amount of pyruvate that you can handle over here, because you have double the Krebs cycle, you have double the electron transport chain, you've got double the pH. And if you imagine that all of these interactions are random chance, so when I put more PDH in a room, there's a greater chance you're going to bump into it if you're a pyruvate molecule, right? And so that's kind of what's happening. So we'll talk more about that when we get into adaptation to training. This is just kind of a general thing from an undergraduate textbook. It shows some very kind of gross level of the percentages of aerobic and anaerobic energy contribution for different sports, kind of distances and those kinds of things, right? So, you know, like weightlifting, diving, gymnastics, 100-meter dash, kind of your short bursting things in football are going to be primarily predominant anaerobic things. Things that are going to be somewhat intermittent, like they put soccer here, is it like 70% anaerobic? I think that's bullshit, right? I mean, you're going to sprint and then stand during all of that because they jog around a bunch. The soccer's kind of intermittent, okay? We're just going to move our way down. We're going to get into another one for sorts of things. They're going to be primarily like solely outside of the very, very important. I'm not really going to ask you anything about all of that too much. Okay. Okay. We'll start talking about carbohydrate metabolism. And then that way we won't get through all. So the next piece that we need to go over is we're going to talk about what's happening in aerobic metabolism, specifically as we're going to break down carbohydrates, so glucose, okay, versus fats or liquid tissues. And so the pathway is going to be a little bit where things enter in. So when we talk about carbohydrates, you guys need to understand that we're going to store some level of carbohydrates, glucose in the bloodstream. Not that much, depending upon what you eat. You've got muscle glycogen, where you're going to have kind of your largest stores, and then you're going to have some liver glycogen that's going to vary. All of these carbohydrate stores can, in fact, be manipulated by not eating carbohydrates. Okay? Or by not eating carbohydrates and then doing long bouts of exercise. So, I saved the study today. I think we were talking about how much muscle glycogen depletion you're getting during weightlifting or something in like your 2x fibers. It's like almost all gone in like a very, very short period of time. I see these things, I'm like, well, I need to read that paper, and then I never get around to reading that paper. But it would be useful for you guys. So, if this is where we're storing the carbs, if we need those carbohydrates to be able to metabolize them, to get energy, how are we going to get them out of what we're going to call our various storage places and into the muscle? Okay? The first way is how we're going to get plasma glucose. Okay? We're going to get glucose out of the bloodstream and in. So this will be from what we call free glucose. So this is glucose from food you've eaten that's circulating around in your blood. Or it's going to be from glucose that has come from the breakdown of liver glycogen, which has been done. So the first way that we get things in is through a single molecule. Primarily, it's going to be through something called GLUT4. Okay? GLUT4 is the pathway that is activated by insulin. And so you eat carbohydrates, your blood glucose levels rise, the pancreas releases insulin. The insulin binds to receptors on your muscles, it moves the GLUT4 to the muscle membrane, and then you take the glucose out of your blood into the muscle. Okay? Now, it can also jam some of that into adipose tissue and things we're going to talk about that. But that's what's going to happen. The GLUT4 moves to insulin. Weirdly enough, you might think, oh, well, then insulin should go up during exercise. I need to put glucose into my cells during exercise. In fact, insulin is like the only hormone that goes down during exercise. Because if it didn't go down, you would die. You'd go into a coma because your blood glucose level is low. So insulin signals GLUT4. Strangely enough, and we don't know how, we've been looking for 50 years. Again, this is Nobel Prize week because they've been out Nobel Prizes this week. They've been giving out Nobel Prizes this week. I will just reiterate that. Okay? I get a CNN update every morning. I wake up and it's like, oh, the Nobel Prize in Literature was given to some woman from here who wrote some poetry. So good for her. And there was a thing yesterday was either the one in medicine or biology or something. It seems pretty important and pretty cool. But when we figure out how muscle contraction activate and trigger GLUT4 to go from inside the cell to the membrane, that will win a Nobel Prize. We've been looking for it for 50 years and we can't figure out the exact all of the steps. We will. Okay? So the insulin or muscle contractions activates GLUT4, that's going to pull glucose out of the blood. The other way that we're going to do it is going to be through a process called glycolysis, and that's going to be driven by the phosphorylase enzyme. Either in the muscle, so we're going to use phosphorylase in the muscle to break down muscle glycogen, and then the glucose is already in the muscle and available, or as we begin to take some glucose out of the blood, that's going to activate the phosphorylase enzymes to begin breaking down liver glycogen, and that liver glycogen is going to turn into glucose, is going to get put into the blood. Okay? At almost all costs, the body wants to maintain a certain kind of baseline level of glucose in the blood. If it doesn't, then the brain will make you pass out. The solution to too low of blood glucose is coma. Okay? Because then if you go into a coma, your metabolic rate will fall. And hopefully, the brain needs glucose. The brain runs on glucose. And so at all costs, there's a bare minimum. That becomes important during long distance exercise. Because at some point, when you've used up all the muscle glycogen, and all you have left is blood glucose, and then all you have left from the blood glucose is not what you've eaten, but what you can break down from liver glycogen, there is going to be a limit. There's going to be a time point at which you may not have enough stored to be able to keep your blood glucose levels at a certain place. As they begin to fall, then the brain is going to begin to inhibit your muscles, and you're going to feel like shit, and you're going to want to stop. Okay? And so it's that's where drinking Gatorade, having a candy bar, having those little goo packs or the gummy bears or whatever. That's when that's going to occur. That's how this is going to. That's how that's going to work. Okay. So we talked about this, right? There are both insulin dependent and insulin independent ways to take glucose up into the muscle. So there's glucose transport proteins, GLUT1 through GLUT5. The insulin dependent one is GLUT4, is found primarily in skeletal muscle and fat in the heart. And then the insulin independent ones are in the liver and the brain. And you've got number 2, and then you've got GLUT1 and GLUT3 are going to be the red blood cells. As I said, we tightly regulate blood glucose from around about 100 milligrams per deciliter at rest. Has anyone done a glucose tolerance test? But no glucose tolerance test? No? How many of you took human phys here on campus? Okay. The three of you did a glucose tolerance test in human phys. You drank a little sugary drink, and they pricked your finger, right? And they measured your blood glucose levels.
Now.
You're not forced to, you had to volunteer. Oh, okay.
Yeah, we did that.
I thought everybody had to. That's a glucose tolerance test. And so it measures, you drink the thing, it measures how quickly you can bring that known amount of glucose back down to that kind of level around 100. If you're ever going to go, we're going to do exercise screening. For exercise screening, we need to know somebody's resting plasma glucose level to know if they're diabetic or pre-diabetic or if they're okay. That's where that 100 number is going to come in. That's why that's one of kind of our cut points. Okay, that's where we're going to try to be regulating around. Don't, if you're going to have that done, do what my doctor did to me and have me come in and check me over and be like, oh yeah, we're going to do blood work on you today. Is that okay? And I'm like, no, like I had breakfast and lunch. And then they run the glucose levels. They're like, oh my God, we think you're diabetic. And I'm like, no, I had lunch. 30 minutes ago before we did things. And then they checked my A1, so they're like, no, you're not diabetic. Thank you. I told you all. Like my glucose and cholesterol numbers are going to be all over the place because I ate. Anyway, so there can be different changes in blood glucose levels. Postprandial means after. So blood glucose levels are going to potentially change after you eat something that has carbs in it. There's an increase in a very kind of regular manner over about a 2-hour period or maybe an hour and a half period. Afterwards, we starve you when we don't let you eat with the gym, and then other things are going to happen during exercise. Generally, early on in exercise, if it's aerobic exercise, we should begin to see a little bit of a spike, maybe just a touch of a spike from an increase in breakdown of liver glycogen, and it tends to stay pretty stable over time until we kind of get out and the muscle glycogen is gone and it's a little bit slower. Okay? So that's kind of what's going on there. Okay. Quickly, we'll do this thing and we'll call it a day. Here is a cartoon of the insulin signaling pathway. Here's the insulin receptor. Here's insulin binding to the insulin receptor. I don't know for sure that people would say this is the most well-characterized receptor for a hormone in your body, or for anything in your body. You can maybe make an argument that the acetylcholine receptor is just as much as known, but we know a lot about this because of diabetes. Because we need to understand that especially type 2 diabetics, it doesn't seem to work right. You bind the insulin, but you don't get the proper downstream. You don't have to know all of these things. You don't have to understand that we're going to phosphorylate down here on the bottom. It's going to activate or more. We've got creatine kinase and PK, AKT, these kinds of things. Other stuff that we don't fully understand. That are going to tell the GLUT4 to come up here and do all of this. It's also going to, this is why insulin is important for muscle growth, that having this also seems to stimulate the MAP kinase pathway, which is the interactive mTOR, which is the primary pathway that drives the protein synthesis for muscle growth. This is why, okay, that if I consume protein, Kelvin's having this protein afterwards, he probably also needs to have his protein with some carbohydrates in his kind of post-exercise state, because that's going to stimulate insulin to be released. The exercises, testosterone and growth hormone go up, insulin goes down. And then afterwards, you're having the protein, which is good, but you also need some carbs, so you can stimulate the insulin signaling to get this kind of further boost to your MAP kinase and mTOR. That's why that is one of the greater. So we know there's insulin mediated. We know also that in the absence of this, when you contract skeletal muscle, it circumvents this somehow, it activates the same pathway. We think it may have something to do with calcium interacting somewhere in here and turning the pathway on. That seems like one of the most likely candidates, but we don't really know. So what you can see here is this is just showing, this is transport of glucose, and then this is the glucose. This is what's happening over time in a bout of exercise. And you can just note that in about 5 minutes, just from contracting skeletal muscle, the glucose transport, which is going to be very closely tied to glucose in the membrane. Glucose in the membrane is going to go up within 5 minutes of doing muscle contraction. Transport follows. You're doing 40. It's just showing that in the absence of insulin, we're going to still be able to get this translocation so we can shut off more glucose into our cells. So we can potentially have it available to run through glycolysis, either making the lactic acid or that's as reasonable a place as any for us to stop. We'll pick up with how we turn on phosphorylase and kind of some of the allosteric processes that are going to work with phosphorylase so that we can not just get into the muscle, but talk about how we break glycogen. We'll start with that. We'll do quiz on Tuesday. I'll hopefully give back the tests on Tuesday. And depending upon how y'all did on the test, y'all may be so mad at me that we get nothing else accomplished. So, I have high levels of confidence that y'all are going to do well.
What if I inject myself with insulin?
Yes, do it.
And